All right, so we're just beginning part 2 of on the mode of existence of technical objects. So we finished part 1 last time. So part 1 was primarily looking at the evolution of technical objects. So we introduced this notion of concretization, and we saw how that works in different examples. So part 2 is about the relationship between technology and the human being. Chapter 1, the title is The Two Fundamental Modes of Relation Between Man and the Technical Given. I think we'll be able to get through probably 2 sections today. The third section is a little bit longer, so maybe we'll save sections 3 and 4 of this chapter for next time, but we'll see how far we get through. So I'll start reading, and then other people can pick up from there if you would like. Okay, so section 1, social majority and minority of techniques. We would like to show that the technical object can be connected with man in 2 opposing ways, according to the status of majority or of minority. The status of minority is one whereby the technical object is firstly an object of utility, necessary for everyday life, belonging to the heart of the environment where the human individual's growth and training takes place. In this case, the encounter between the technical object and man occurs essentially during childhood. Technical knowledge is implicit, non-reflective, and habitual. Conversely, the status of majority corresponds to an operation of reflection and self-awareness by the free adult, who has at his disposal the means of rational knowledge elaborated through the sciences. The knowledge of the apprentice is thus distinguished from that of the engineer. Once the apprentice has become an adult craftsman and the engineer has been integrated into a network of social relations, they retain and project a vision of the technical object that corresponds, in the first case, to the minority status, and in the second case, to the majority status. What we have here are 2 very different sources of representation and judgment related to the technical object. However, the craftsman and the engineer don't merely live for themselves. They are both witnesses to and agents of the relation between human society as a whole and the world of technical objects, and they have an exemplary value. It is through them that the technical object is incorporated into culture. To the present day, these 2 modes of incorporation have not been capable of providing corroborating results, to the extent that there is something akin to 2 different languages and types of thought arising from techniques that are incoherent with each other. This lack of coherence is partly responsible for the contradictions of contemporary culture, to the extent that it judges and represents the technical object in relation to man. So this is again the theme that we saw in the introduction and in the technical mentality paper about the incorporation of techniques into culture and different modes of relating to techniques. Would someone like to read the next paragraph? No volunteers?
Sure, I can go. Moreover, this conflict between the majority aspect and the minority aspect is only a particular case of inadequacy that has always existed between the individual or social man and technical reality. Throughout antiquity, a large part of technical operations were excluded from the domain of thought. They were operations that corresponded to servile occupations. Just as the slave was excluded from the city, servile occupations and the technical objects corresponding to them were banned from the universe of discourse, reflexive thought, and culture. Only the sophists, and to a certain extent Socrates, made the effort to introduce the technical operations practiced by slaves or freedmen into the domain of noble thought. Majority status was granted to only a few operations, such as agriculture, hunting, war, and the art of navigation. Techniques that used tools were kept outside the domain of culture. Cicero takes most of his metaphors from the noble arts, in particular agriculture and navigation. The mechanical arts are rarely evoked by him. Should I keep going?
Yeah, I think this is pretty straightforward at this point, so we probably don't need to discuss too much here. So yeah, maybe you can continue with the next paragraph.
Going further back in time, one discovers that such and such a civilization also created the distinction between noble techniques and non-noble techniques. The history of the Jewish people reserves a privileged place for pastoral techniques and considers the land as cursed. God accepts the offerings of Abel, but not those of Cain. The pastor is superior to the farmer. The Bible contains a multitude of schemas of thought and paradigms drawn from various ways for helping to foster the flock. Conversely, the Gospels introduce modes of thought taken from the experience of agriculture. Perhaps one could find a certain technological bias at the origin of mythologies and religions, consecrating one technique as noble and not granting citizenship to the others, even when they are used effectively. This initial choice between a major and a minor technique, between a valued technique and a devalued technique, grants an aspect of partiality, of non-universality, to the culture that incorporates technical schemas. Our research does not propose to ascertain the reasons and modalities of this choice between fundamental techniques in each particular case, but simply to show that human thought must establish an egalitarian relation, without privilege, between techniques and man. This task must still be accomplished because these phenomena of technical dominance, because of which there is, in each epoch, a part of the technical world that is recognized by culture, while other parts of the technical world are rejected, maintain an inadequate relation between human reality and technical reality.
Right. So here, it's not technology as a whole. In ancient Greek and the biblical Jewish culture, it's not technology as a whole that is excluded, but there is certain fields of technique that are incorporated into culture and that are valued, that are drawn upon for metaphors and that are sort of incorporated into thought. But then there are other domains that are excluded and devalued. And so the task that Simondon is proposing here is to try to incorporate all aspects of technique. So everything that is part of the technique of our culture should be incorporated into thought in the same way. Okay, so I'll continue from here, unless anyone else is dying to read. No, okay. The disappearance of slavery in Western Europe allowed ancient servile techniques to come to light and manifest themselves in clear thought. The Renaissance recognized artisanal techniques by shedding the light of rationality upon them. Rational mechanics introduced machines into the domain of mathematical thought. Descartes calculated the transformations of movement within the simple machines used by the slaves of antiquity. This effort towards rationalization, signifying an integration into culture, continued up until the end of the 18th century. Yet despite this, the unity of techniques did not persist. A genuine reversal took place, which repressed the ancient noble techniques, those of agriculture and animal husbandry, into the domain of the irrational, the non-cultural. The relation to the natural world was lost, and the technical object became an artificial object, distancing man from the world. We are only now beginning to see the possibility of an encounter between the way of thinking inspired by techniques related to living beings and an artificialist way of thinking concerned with constructing automata. Mechanical techniques were only truly able to attain majority status by becoming a techniques thought by the engineer, rather than remaining the techniques of the craftsman. At the artisanal level, the concrete relation between the world and the technical object still exists, but the object thought by the engineer is an abstract technical object, unattached to the natural world. In order for culture to incorporate technical objects, one would have to discover an intermediary between the majority status and the minority status of technical objects. The condition of the disjunction between culture and techniques resides in a disjunction that exists within the world of techniques itself. In order to discover an adequate relation between man and the technical object, one would have to be able to discover a unity of the technical world through a representation that would incorporate both that of the craftsman and that of the engineer. The representation of the craftsman is drowned in concreteness, engaged in material manipulations and sensible existence. It is dominated by its object. The representation of the engineer is one of domination. It turns the object into a bundle of measured relations, a product, a set of characteristics. So we saw the two spheres of technique in the last paragraph, the valued and the devalued, and then now in this paragraph, this distinction is brought into the two modes of relating to technique. So you have the craftsman and the engineer. And the craftsman works on these devalued techniques, and then the engineer works on the valued techniques. So the task here is to integrate these two modes of relating to technique, the craftsman and the engineer. Would someone like to read the next couple paragraphs?
Hello, I could try.
Sure, thanks.
The prime condition for the incorporation of technical objects into culture would thus be for man to be neither inferior nor superior to technical objects, but rather that he would be capable of approaching and getting to know them through entertaining a relation of equality with them, that is, a reciprocity of exchanges, a social relation of sorts. The compatibility or incompatibility between different technological modes is worth subjecting to a conditional analysis. Perhaps it will be possible to discover the conditions of compatibility between one technology and another, such as that of the Romans and that elaborated by the civilized societies of our day. Perhaps it will be possible to discover a real, if unapparent, incompatibility between the technological conditions of the 19th century and those of the mid-20th century. Certain myths born from the inappropriate encounter between two incompatible technological paradigmatisms could then be brought back to their initial conditions and analyzed.
So here it's probably worth pointing out again that Simondon uses the word technology not for the objects themselves, for machines and computers and so on, but for the study or the thinking of technique of machines and computers. So when he talks about technology in this paragraph, he's talking about the mode of apprehending in thought the technical reality. So he's talking about the incompatibility between certain representations of technical reality and the technical reality itself. So if we're using 19th century concepts to understand 20th century technology, then we're going to have this incompatibility, and we're not going to be able to incorporate all elements of technical reality into culture. Right, so that's the first section, just introducing these two modes of relating to technology and to the modes relating to the technical reality, and setting the task of integrating those two modes. So we're going to see a little bit more of that in the next section. So section 2, techniques learned by the child and techniques thought by the adult. One cannot study the status of the technical object in a civilization without taking into account the difference between the relation of this object to the adult and the child. Even if life in modern societies has accustomed us to thinking that there is a continuity between the life of the child and of the adult, the history of technical education quickly shows that the distinction did exist, and that the characteristics of the acquisition of technical knowledge are not the same depending on whether this acquisition takes place in the adults or in the child. We have no intention whatsoever of laying down a normative rule, but merely of showing that the characteristics of teaching techniques have varied greatly throughout time, and that they have varied not only due to the state of techniques or the structure of societies, but also because of the age of the subjects who were learning. One could discover therein a circular relation of causality between the state of techniques and the age of knowledge acquisition, constituting the technician's qualifications. If a very, very poorly rationalized techniques requires an extremely precocious initiation of learning, then the subject will, even as an adult, retain a basic irrationality in his technical knowledge. He will possess it by virtue of a very profound acquisition due to his early habitual immersion. As a result, the technician's knowledge will not consist of clearly represented schemas, but of a manual dexterity possessed almost by instinct, and entrusted to this second nature that is habit. His science will be at the level of sensorial and qualitative representations, very close to the concrete aspects of matter. This man will be endowed with a power of intuition and complicity with the world that will give him a very remarkable aptitude that can only manifest itself in work and not in consciousness or discourse. The craftsman will be like a magician, and his knowledge will be operational rather than intellectual. It will be an ability rather than a knowing. By its very nature, it will be a secret for others because it will be a secret for himself, for his own consciousness. So this is going into more detail about the craftsman mode of relation to technical reality that was mentioned in the last section, and we also saw this in the technical mentality paper that we read about 6 weeks ago or something like that. Yeah, we're going to see more on this. So that the Craftsman mode of relation to technical reality is the one that is learned as a child, and so it doesn't involve intellectual representation of the functioning of the technical reality. It's a habituation to the functioning of the technical reality, and it doesn't involve conscious knowledge of the principles of that functioning.
If I may, I find these sections especially interesting. I don't think it's very often that Simondon is getting into psychology, and in this case, he seems to be stepping into the zone of what's called developmental psychology, as the study of this gradual maturation of human cognitive capacities. And in this case, of course, he illustrates those differences in the domain of techniques. Of course, those terms like concreteness have different significations in this context, I believe. The term concrete takes on another association. It's no longer open to further developments. It is associated with a certain closeness.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So he does use the word concrete here, the concrete aspects of matter. So I'm not sure whether he intends to point back towards his notion of concretization that we saw in the first part of the book. So whether he's characterizing artisanal or craftsman knowledge as being related to more concretized technical objects. I think it might be more that he's pointing towards, just the relationship of craftsman knowledge to the material properties of the technical object rather than an intellectual representation of their functioning.
Yeah, I believe they are different. Yeah.
Would someone like to read the next couple paragraphs?
Sure, I can go again. To this day, we find the existence of this technical subconsciousness, which cannot be verbalized in clear terms by reflective activity, in farmers or shepherds capable of directly grasping the value of seeds, the exposure of a plot, the best place to plant a tree or to set up a pasture so that it is sheltered and well positioned. These men are experts in the etymological sense of the term. They take part in the living nature of the thing they know, and their knowing is one of profound, direct participation that necessitates an original symbiosis, including a kind of fraternity with a valued and qualified aspect of the world. Man here behaves like an animal who smells water or salt from a distance, who immediately knows where to choose the place for a nest without prior reasoning. Such participation is of an instinctive nature, and it is only present when the life of successive generations has made the rhythm of life, the conditions of perception, and the essential mental structures adapt to a kind of activity aimed at a stable nature. In his remarkable tale titled The Mines of Fallon, E.T.A. Hoffman describes a similar power of intuition in the miner. He feels danger and can find minerals in the most hidden veins. He lives in a kind of co-natural relation with underground nature, and this co-naturalness is so profound that it excludes all other feeling or attachment. The true miner is a subterranean man, the one who descends into the mine without loving it. The man who descends into the mine without loving it won't discover this essential co-naturalness, as is the case with the errant sailor who bravely signs up to work in the mine because he loves a young girl. He becomes the mine's victim on the very morning of his wedding. There is no morality here. The young sailor is full of merit and virtue, but he is a sailor and not a miner. He doesn't have the intuition of the mine. The phantom of the old miner warns him of the danger he is in, because the mine rejects the intruder as one who comes from outside, from another trade, from another life, and who is not endowed with the power of participation. In the farmer, the shepherd, the miner, and the sailor, human nature doubles as a second nature, which is like an ancestral pact with an element or a region. It is difficult to say whether this sense of participation is acquired in the first years of life or whether it is involved in a hereditary patrimony. What remains certain is that this kind of technical training, formation, consisting of intuitions and purely concrete operative schemas that are very difficult to formulate or transmit through any kind of symbolism, be it oral or figurative, belongs to childhood. For this same reason, it is unlikely to evolve and can hardly be reformed in adulthood. It is not, in fact, of a conceptual or scientific nature and cannot be modified through oral or written symbolism.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with this story by Hoffman, but I think the sort of moral that he's drawing from the story is pretty clear. So he's developing further this idea of the relationship to technical reality through that is learned in childhood, and that it is a non-intellectual relationship that consists, he says, consists in intuitions and operative schemas. So it's a concrete relationship to a technical reality rather than an abstract intellectual one. Okay, so I'll read the next bit. This technical training is rigid. It would be entirely wrong to consider this technical training as necessarily inferior to a training using intellectual symbols. The quantity of information of this type of instinctive training can be as great as that contained within knowledge clearly explained through symbols, graphs, schemas, or formulas. It is too easy to oppose routine to science, which would by the same token be progress. Primitiveness cannot be confused with stupidity, any more than conceptualization with science. But it is worth noting that this technical knowledge is effectively rigid, since man cannot become a child again in order to acquire new basic intuitions. Furthermore, this form of techniques has a second characteristic. This characteristic is one of initiation, and it is exclusive. It is indeed by growing up in a community that is already fully saturated with the schemas of a particular work that the child acquires base intuitions. The one who comes from the outside will more than likely be deprived of this initial participation that requires the existence of vital conditions, because the vital conditions are educational in this primary sense. It would, without a doubt, be wrong to attribute the closure of ancient techniques to the closure of the communitarian life of societies. Such societies, in fact, knew how to open themselves up, as the temporary or seasonal migration of farmers from Auvergne to Paris toward the end of the 19th century shows. It is techniques itself that corresponds in this case to a closed regime of life, because technical training is valid only for the society that formed it, and is therefore the only one valid for that society. It seems that historians are inclined to consider the rites of initiation of ancient trades in a rather abstract manner, by looking at them from a purely sociological point of view. It is worth noting that there are tests that correspond to a regime of acquisition of technical knowledge by the child. The test is thus not only a social rite, but also an act through which the young subject becomes an adult by taming the world, by measuring himself with it in a critical circumstance, and by triumphing. There is a certain magic in this test, which is an act through which the child becomes a man, by using all his strength pushed to its extreme limit for the first time. If he weakens or shows himself to be inferior in this dangerous confrontation with the world and with matter, he risks foregoing the effectiveness of his manly action. If a hostile nature cannot be defeated, the man cannot become a complete adult, because a gap has arisen between nature and himself. The test is a lifelong enchantment of the technical being. It is an operation that creates the obedience of matter to man, who has become its master because he succeeded in taming it, like an animal that becomes docile from the day it first allowed itself to be led. If the first gesture is a mishap, the animal rebels and remains wild. It will never again accept this master, who will himself forever be lacking in self-assurance because the immediate contact has been broken. In this test, a law of all or nothing manifests itself. Man and the world are therein transformed, an asymmetrical union is constituted. One must not say that the test is a demonstration of courage or ability as if it were simply an exam. It creates these qualities because courage is made by way of an immediate and certain connection with the world, which wards off all uncertainty and all hesitation. Courage is not a defeated fear, but a fear always warded off by the presence of an intuition, because of which the world is with the one who acts. The skillful man is the one whom the world accepts, whom matter loves and obeys, with the faithful docility of an animal who has recognized his master. Skill is one of the forms of power, and power supposes an enchantment, making an exchange of forces possible, or rather a more primitive and more natural mode of participation than that of enchantment, which is already very elaborate and partially abstract. In this sense, skill is not the exercise of a violent despotism, but of a force conforming to the being which conducts it. There is, in the true power of the skillful man, a relation of recurrent causality. The true technician loves the matter upon which he acts. He is on its side. He is initiated, but respects that to which he is initiated. He forms a couple with this matter after having tamed it, and only delivers it with caution to the profane, because he has a sense of the sacred. The craftsman and the farmer to this day still experience an aversion to consigning some works or products to commerce that express their most refined and most perfect technical activity. This prohibition of commerciality, of divulgation, can be seen in the not-for-sale print of a book that a printer, editor, or author can distribute. It can also be seen in the Pyrenean farmer who offers his visitor a certain food in his home, which can neither be bought nor taken away. So I think this is pretty straightforward, but just further developing on the artisanal relationship to technical reality, which is acquired through childhood, and there's this concept of the rite of initiation or the test. So this is something that appears in many societies, but I think he's thinking of medieval guilds in Western Europe, where you had to perform a certain work in order to be accepted as a member of a full member of the guild. So you have to perform a specific task, and it serves both as a rite of initiation and also as a test of your skill. And so I think that's the type of rite that he's thinking of here. Okay, so who would like to continue from here?
I can do the next part. The secret and the stable aspect of such a technique is thus not only a product of social conditions, it produces the structure of groups as much as the structure of the group conditions it. It is possible that every technique must, to a certain extent, contain a coefficient of intuition and instinct necessary for establishing the appropriate communication between man and the technical being. But besides this first aspect of technical formation, there exists a second aspect that stands in an inverse relation to the first, and which is essentially aimed at the adult. As in the preceding case, there is a dynamic action exerted on the individual man and on the group, leading him to possess an adult mentality. I carry on.
Continue.
Yeah. The second type of technical knowledge is a rational, theoretical, scientific, and universal knowledge. The best example is Diderot and can't read that name, Encyclopedia. If the Encyclopedia appeared as a powerful and dangerous work, then it was not because of its veiled or direct attacks on a certain abuse of privilege, nor because of the philosophical aspect of certain articles. There were more violent libels and pamphlets than Encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia was respectfully feared because it was moved by an enormous force, that of a technical encyclopedism, a force that had brought together powerful and enlightened protectors. This force existed by itself, because it responded to the needs of its time, more than political or financial reforms did. It was this force that was positive and creative, and which realized an equally remarkable assembly of researchers, editors, and correspondents by granting a face to this team composed of men who collaborated without being connected through social or religious communities. A great work had to be carried out. The greatness of the encyclopedia, its novelty, resides in the fact that its prints of schemas and models of machines, which are an homage to the trades and to the rational knowledge of technical operations, are fundamentally major. But these prints do not have the role of pure disinterested documentation for a public eager to satisfy its curiosity. The information in them is complete enough to constitute a usable practical documentation, such that anyone who owns a book will be capable of building the described machine, or further advancing the state reached by the techniques that domain through an invention, and to begin his research where that of others who preceded him leaves off.
Right. So he's discussed the minor mode of relation to technical reality, and now he's passing to the major mode, so the intellectual mode of of relation to technical reality. And then so his example of this mode is the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert. So this was in the late 18th century. A number of the sort of leading intellectuals in France whose work sort of fed into the French Revolution. They worked together on this massive encyclopedia, which was supposed to contain basically the peak of human knowledge at that time. One, I guess, noteworthy aspect of this encyclopedia is that it includes very detailed technical knowledge. So like graphical representation of how different machines work, the different tools that different trades use, and so on. So it's not just sort of high culture and scientific knowledge, but also technical knowledge is incorporated into the encyclopedia. So that's what he's pointing to here. It's the knowledge of different trades is brought into intellectual culture for the first time. Would someone else like to read the next paragraph?
Okay, I'll go again. The method and structure of this new way of teaching stands in an inverse relation to the preceding one. It is rational and doubly universal. This is why it is adult. It is rational because it employs measurement, calculation, procedures of geometrical figuration, and descriptive analysis. It is also rational because it calls upon objective explanations and invokes experimental results with the aim of a precise presentation of conditions, treating as a hypothesis what is conjectural, and as established fact whatever one must consider as such. Not only is scientific explanation required, but it is required with a clear taste for the scientific spirit. Moreover, this way of teaching is doubly universal, both through the public it addresses and through the information it provides. Of course, what is taught here is high-level knowledge, but despite this, it is meant for all. The cost of the book alone limits the possible purchases. This knowledge is given in the spirit of the highest possible universality, according to a circular schema that never supposes that a technical operation is closed in on itself through the secret of its speciality, but rather that it is related to other operations using analogous types of apparatuses and based upon a small number of principles. For the first time, one sees a technical universe constituting itself, a cosmos wherein everything is related to everything else rather than being jealously guarded by a guild. This consistent and objective universality, which supposes an internal resonance of this technical world, requires that the book be open to all and that it constitute a material and intellectual universality, a block of available and open technical knowledge. This teaching supposes an adult subject capable of directing himself and of discovering by himself his own normativity without being directed by another being. The autodidact is necessarily an adult. A society of autodidacts cannot accept tutelage and the status of spiritual minority. It aspires to govern itself on its own and to manage itself. It is principally in this sense and through its technological power that the encyclopedia brought about a new force and a new social dynamic. The causal circularity of encyclopedic knowledge excludes the moral and political heteronomy of the monarchy, l'Ancien Régime. The technical world discovers its independence when it realizes its unity. The encyclopedia is a kind of fête de la fédération, of technics discovering their solidarity for the first time.
Right, so here he's drawing the analogy between this technical majority, so the capacity to have this intellectual understanding of technical principles and to relate them to each other, rather than learning it in this sort of passive way as a child. So he's relating this technical majority to the idea of political majority, which sort of comes to the fore in the French Revolution. So the idea of being self-governing rather than having a monarch that governs for us or that rules over us. Okay, so we got through the first two sections faster than I expected, so I think we might as well continue with the third section. I'm not sure if we'll be able to finish the full section or go on to section 4, but we'll see how far we get. So section 3, the common nature of minor techniques and major techniques, the signification of encyclopedism. We shall attempt to analyze the relation between the encyclopedic spirit and the technical object, because it appears indeed to be one of the poles of all technical awareness, and thus possesses, in addition to its historical signification, a sense of the knowledge of technicity that is still valid. We have opposed the implicit, instinctive, and magical aspect of technical education aimed at the child to the inverse aspects of the latter, which one discovers in the Encyclopedia. This opposition runs the risk of masking a deep analogy of the dynamisms inherent in the structurations of technical knowledge. Encyclopedism manifests and propagates a certain inversion of technique's fundamental dynamisms. This inversion is nevertheless possible only because operations are not annihilated, but displaced and in a way turned around. The Encyclopedia also manipulates and transfers forces and powers. It too performs an enchantment and draws a circle like the magic circle, except that it does not enchant by the same means as those inherent in the testing of instinctive knowledge, and it is not the same reality that it places within the circle of knowledge. It is human society with its forces and obscure powers that is placed within the circle, having become immense and capable of comprising everything. This circle is represented and constituted by the objective reality of the book. Everything that is represented in the encyclopedic book is at the service of the individual who has in his possession a figural symbol of all human activities and their most secret details. The encyclopedia makes initiation universal, and thereby produces a sort of rupture in the very sense of initiation. The secret of the objectified universal maintains a positive sense of the notion of the secret, the perfection of knowledge, a familiarity with the sacred, but annihilates the negative aspect, obscurity, a means of exclusion through mystery, knowledge reserved to a small number of men. Technics becomes an exoteric mystery. There's a footnote here. Part of this feeling of the efficacy of primitive magic has turned into the unconditional belief in progress. The object that is modern or has a modern aura, allure, is endowed with an almost supernatural, surnaturel efficacy. The feeling of modernity comprises something of the belief in an unlimited and polyvalent power of the privileged object. That's the end of the footnote. The Encyclopedia is a magic cipher, and is all the more efficient as it has been built with a more precise, more exact, and more objective representation of its model. All the active resources, all the living forces of human operations are assembled in this object symbol. Each individual capable of reading and of understanding possesses the voûte of the world and of society. Magically, everyone is master of everything because he possesses the voûte of the whole. The cosmos, once enveloping and superior to the individual, and the social circle constraining and always eccentric with respect to the power of the individual, are now in the hands of the individual, like the globe representing the world which the emperors carry as a sign of sovereignty. The power, the confidence of the reader of the encyclopedia is the same as that of a man who first attacked the effigy of an animal before confronting it in nature. The same once again as that of the primitive farmer who entrusted the seeds to the soil after having performed propitiatory rites, or the voyager who ventured to new places only after having rendered them in some way favorable through an act of establishing communion and prepossession, of which the Odyssey preserves a memory. Footnote here, the right of possession of the earth accomplished by Ulysses approaching the island of the Phaeacians. End of footnote. The gesture of initiation is a union with a reality that remains hostile so long as it hasn't been tamed and possessed. It is for this reason that all initiation leads to virility and adulthood. Thus, from a psychosociological point of view, every manifestation of the encyclopedic spirit can appear within a society as a fundamental movement, mouvement de fond, expressing the need for attaining a state of freedom and adulthood, since the current regime or customs of thought retain individuals within a state of tutelage and artificial minority. This will to move from a minority to a majority by way of enlarging the circle of knowledge and liberating the power inherent in knowing is what we encounter on 3 occasions in the history of thought since the Middle Ages. The first manifestation of the encyclopedic spirit is what constitutes the Renaissance and is contemporary with the ethical and religious revolution of the Reformation. To want to move from the Vulgate to the veritable text of the Bible, looking for the Greek text rather than contenting oneself with poor Latin translations, rediscovering Plato beyond the scholastic tradition crystallized according to a fixed dogma, is to refuse the arbitrary limitation of thought and knowledge. Erudition represents not a return to the past as past, but the will to enlarge the circle of knowledge, to rediscover all of human thought in order to be freed from a limitation of knowledge. So that was a kind of a long section, but I think the fundamental idea is the idea of encyclopedism as incorporating this idea of initiation, but turning it into a sort of public initiation. So rather than being initiated into a private, secret technique, it's an initiation into a public and open technique.
By the way, the form of the argument strikes me as really dialectical here. He started off by positing this distinction between minor and major as an opposition. And now he's saying we can find the kind of enchantment we find in minor also in major mode of access to technical objects. And so he does this cross-pollination that is, in spirit, it seems dialectical to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. He does, on a few occasions, he sort of criticizes the idea of dialectics in the sense of, so he rejects the idea that there is a negation included in the initial terms. So the idea of dialectics operating through negation and then overcoming that negation, the sort of Hegelian model of dialectics. So he rejects that model. But I think the conceptual schema that he uses, like this mode of arguments in this section, can be characterized as dialectical in the sense that it's, like you pointed out, it's this sort of setting up an opposition and then overcoming that opposition at a higher level. So would someone like to read the next paragraph, or maybe a couple paragraphs?
I can read a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
The humanism of the Renaissance is not at all a will to redeploy a fixed image of man in order to restrain and normalize knowledge, as the decay into which the study of classical antiquity has fallen would appear to suggest today. Humanism, first of all, responds to an encyclopedic movement, elan. But this movement is always oriented towards already formalized knowledge because the level of technical development was not sufficiently advanced so as to allow a rapid formalization of this domain to intervene. The sciences in particular were too underdeveloped. The intellectual means of universalizing techniques were not ready. It is the 17th century that brought about the means for universalizing techniques, which the Encyclopedia then put to work. Nevertheless, we should note the very positive attitude towards techniques from the Renaissance onward. Already with the Renaissance, techniques are valued as a paradigm and means of expression, or for their human value, which opens new paths. Rabelais' magnificent praise of the Pantagruelion plant summarizes all the hopes of the men of the Renaissance, all their beliefs in the virtue of techniques, thanks to which humanity would perhaps one day be capable of traveling all the way up to the celestial signs, in the same way that humanity had traveled from the old world to the new world. The second encyclopedic stage is that of the Enlightenment. Scientific thought was freed, but technical thought did not find liberation. It is scientific thought that freed technical thought. Since techniques touch on commerce, agriculture, and industry, and these are aspects of society, this technological encyclopedism could not help but be correlated with social and administrative reforms. Institutions such as the elite schools, Grand Écoles, emerged from this encyclopedism. Encyclopedism is by definition polytechnic in its industrial form, just as it is physiocratic in its agricultural form. The industrial aspect becomes more developed than the physiocratic aspect because encyclopedic rationalization facilitated more pronounced transformations in the industrial domain, benefiting from the recent scientific discoveries of the late 18th century. This asymmetrical development, however, should not make us forget that one of the most important components of the technical encyclopedic spirit is the direct link between the individual with the vegetal and animal world, with the biological nature. Rather than leaving it to the descendants of former serfs, the art of plowing is valued even by the most distinguished figures. This is the pastoral era, and a time where a mind as solid as that of Daubenton sees no shame in writing a treatise for shepherds, which is the prototype of generous high-level popularization. unifying the old tradition of didactic works and giving it a new lease on life through the use of a clear graphic symbolism that is almost comprehensible enough for the illiterate. The substance of this beautiful book resides in its etchings, as neat and expressive as those of the Encyclopedia. It must indeed be noted that technology calls for a means of expression other than oral expression, which uses already known concepts and which can transmit emotions, but struggles to express schemas of movement or precise material structures. A symbolism adequate for technical operation is visual symbolism, with its rich play of forms and proportions. The civilization of the word gives way to that of the image. The civilization of the word, in turn, is by its very nature even more exclusive than that of the image, because the image is by nature universal, requiring no prior code of significations. All verbal expression tends to become initiatory. It becomes specialized by becoming a kind of ciphered language, of which the old jargon of the guilds is a clear example. One has to belong to a closed group in order to understand the oral or written language. To understand schematic expression, it is enough to be able to perceive. It is with the schema that technical encyclopedism takes on all of its meaning, sense, and its power of diffusion, by becoming truly universal. The printing press had given rise to a first phase of encyclopedism by distributing texts, but this encyclopedism could only reach reflexive or emotive significations, already sanctioned by the constituted culture, with a printed word as intermediary. The information going from individual to individual makes a detour through the social institution that is language. Through the mediation of the visual sign, printed writing first transmits an oral message, with all the limitations inherent in this mode of expression. To be in possession of all the modern and all the dead languages is necessary for the understanding of an encyclopedism of verbal significations. This possession, or at least the effort going towards this possession, is in part the meaning sense of the Renaissance. But in fact, it remains the privilege of humanists and scholars. Culture does not have any direct universality through oral or written language. It is perhaps for this reason that the Renaissance was unable to establish a technological universality, even though it had a tendency to prefer sculptural and graphic expression to all other symbolism, especially in the arts. Printing, which is a faculty for the diffusion of spatial schema, acquires its full sense in etchings. Yet symbolic etching, used as a means for clearly translating a thought into the terms of structures and operations, freed of any intention in the direction of allegorical expression returning to oral expression, as on a coat of arms, appears with its complete development in the 17th century, as for instance in Descartes' treatises. Having borrowed its expressive force and its power of precision from the common use of geometry, it was now ready to constitute the adequate symbolism of a universal technology.
Right. So he's pointing out. He's talking about this second stage of this encyclopedism. So the first stage was the Renaissance and the Reformation. So it's a primarily written word. So he talks about the civilization of the word here. So it's reappropriation of ancient languages and translations of the Bible, for example. So incorporating these elements into culture through the written word. And then, so as he points out, that this has a certain particularism, I guess you could say, built into it. So it's only a written text is only accessible to someone who actually knows that language. So you have to be brought up in that language or learn it through school or something like that. So it lacks the universality that is present in the image, which is characteristic of the second stage of encyclopedism. So in the Encyclopedia itself, in the Encyclopedia of the 18th century, it relies on these etchings, which contain detailed technical drawings of all the machines and tools and so on. And then he also mentions this book on the book for shepherds, which contains detailed diagrams. So these these diagrams or technical drawings, they are universal in the sense that they don't rely on a previous initiation into a certain language group. So this is a further step in the development of this encyclopedic spirit.
I wonder, based on these comments, differentiating word and image, what we can make of Simondon's own writing. I mean, it is kind of, it has its own initiatory weight. I don't know. It has the capacity of being exclusive itself, I guess, based on what he says.
Yes, that's true. And we've struggled a little bit with some of the earlier aspects where he sort of presupposes a pretty extensive knowledge of like vacuum tube technology, for example, that none of us really have today. So he does rely on this sort of initiation into technical knowledge that a lot of us don't have. So to the extent that he's relying on the written word and a previous initiation into technology, it does remain exclusive in that way. But he also does, well, at least in the translation here, it incorporates a number of drawings between section 1 or part 1 and part 2 of the book. There's I think about 15 or 20 pages worth of drawings and diagrams, which were not included in the initial French version. But he did these diagrams of different technical objects that he discusses in the first part. So he does incorporate some of this this second stage of encyclopedism, the use of the image to try to, I guess, initiate the reader into this technical knowledge that they may not have. Okay, so I'll continue on to the next section. A third stage of encyclopedic thinking finally appears to announce itself in our own era, but hasn't yet succeeded in constituting its modes of universal expression. The civilization of oral symbolism has once more overcome that of spatial visual symbolism, because the new means of diffusion of information have given primacy to oral expression. When information must be converted into a printed object and transported, the delay separating the discovered thought from the expressed thought is the same for written information as it is for figural information. Printing tends to privilege figural information because it necessarily uses the spatial form. The schema is that which does not require translation into a form other than its original form, whereas writing is the translation of a series that is temporal in its origin into a spatial series, which will have to be converted back into a temporal series upon reading it. On the contrary, in the case of information transmitted by telephone, telegraph, or radio waves, the means of transmission requires the translation of a spatial schema into a temporal series, and subsequently its conversion back into a spatial schema. Radio diffusion in particular is directly suited to oral expression and may be adapted to the transmission of a spatial schema only with great difficulty. It consecrates the primacy of sound. Spatial information is thus relegated to the domain of expensive or rare things, always late with respect to oral information, and which is valued because it follows every step of vital coming into being. A civilization, however, is guided by a latent paradigmatism at the level of the information it values. This paradigmatism has once again become oral. Thinking once again takes place according to verbal semantemes of the order of the slogan. The acting presence of interhuman relations is of the order of the verb. There is, of course, cinema and also television, but we must note that due to the very dynamism of its images, cinematography is a cinematic dramatic action rather than a graphics of simultaneity, and not a direct expression of the intelligible and stable form. Subsequent in its discovery to the first attempts at the transmission of images by television, cinematography has completely supplanted the latter and has imposed on it the dynamism of images, which still burdens television with an enormous task and turns it into a competitor or imitator of cinematography, incapable of discovering its own modes of expression, enslaved to the public as a means of pleasure. Cinematographic movement is rich in hypnosis and rhythm that dulls the reflexive faculties of the individual in order to induce a state of aesthetic participation. Organized according to a temporal series that employs visual terms, cinema is an art and a means of expressing emotions. The image here is a word or a phrase. It is not an object comprising a structure to be analyzed by the activity of the individual being. It rarely becomes an immobile and radiating symbol. Furthermore, television could become a means of information contemporary to human activity, which cinema cannot be, since, being a fixed and recorded thing, it puts everything it incorporates into the past. But since television wants to be dynamic, it is obliged to transform every point of its image into a temporal series, in as short a time as the projection of each static image in the cinema. Therefore, it must first of all transform the dynamic into the static through a first cut into images. Then, during the transformation of each fixed image, it transforms the simultaneous points of this fixed image into a temporal series. Upon its arrival, each temporal series transforms itself into a spatial and immobile picture, and the rapid succession of these fixed images, as in cinematography, recreates the analyzed movement according to the characteristics of the perception of movement. This double transformation consequently results in the necessity of transmitting an enormous quantity of information, even for an image that is extremely simple in its intelligible structure. There is no common measure between the quantity of information that is effectively interesting and significant for the subject, and the quantity of information that is technically employed, corresponding to several million signals per second. This waste of information hinders television from being a subtle and faithful means of expression for the individual, and prevents a veritable visual symbolism from constituting itself universally. Radio broadcasts cross boundaries, whereas visual information often remains tied to the communitarian life of groups. It cannot be valued in these conditions. For research into coding systems, useful for inscribing the results of calculating machines on a cathode ray oscilloscope screen, or for displaying signals of electromagnetic detection on the same type of screen, appears capable of conveying a very great simplification of the Hertzian transmission of schematic images. Visual information would thus regain the place that it has lost because of radio broadcasts with respect to spoken language, and would be capable of giving rise to a new universal symbolism. So again, another long paragraph, but so here he's pointing to a third stage of encyclopedism that is incomplete in the time he's writing in the 1950s. So he sees this as the oral culture regaining, or the oral transmission of information regaining primacy in culture, as opposed to the visual transmission of information through images. So radio is his primary model here, I guess. But then he also he looks at television as, even though it transmits visual information, it does so through moving images in time rather than static images, and so it's sort of is modeled on the word and the expression of emotions rather than the visual image, as found in the Encyclopedia, for example, and so it doesn't transmit information in the same way as visual images, etchings in a book or something like that. So who would like to read the next section?
I can read the next few one. The encyclopedic intention in turn begins to show itself within the sciences and techniques, through the tendency towards rationalization of the machine and through establishment of a symbolism common to the machine and to man. It is because of this symbolism that a synergy between man and machine is possible, for common action requires a means of communication, and since man cannot have several types of thought, every translation corresponds to a loss of information. It is this mix of relation between man and machine that a new universal symbolism must emulate in order to be homogeneous with a universal encyclopedism. Cybernetic thinking has already led in information theory to research such as that into human engineering. Here is just, he used the English original one, which specifically studies the relation between man and machine. One can henceforth conceive of an encyclopedism on technological basis. This new encyclopedism must, like the two preceding ones, bring about a liberation, but in a different sense. It cannot be a repetition of the Enlightenment. In the 16th century, man was enslaved to intellectual stereotypes. In the 18th century, he was limited by the hierarchical aspect of social rigidity. In the 20th century, he was enslaved in his dependence on unknown and distant powers that direct him while he can neither know nor react against them. It is isolation that enslaves him, and the lack of homogeneity of information that alienates him. Having become a machine in a mechanized world, he can regain his freedom only by taking on his role and by superseding it through an understanding of technological functions, thought from the point of view of their universality. Every encyclopedism is humanism. If by humanism one means the will to return to a status of freedom, to what has been alienated in man, so that nothing human should be foreign to man. However, this rediscovery can take place in different ways, and each age recreates a humanism that is, to a certain extent, always appropriate to its circumstances, because it takes aim at the most severe aspect of alienation that a civilization contains or produces.
No one has much to say today. There isn't too much discussion compared to last week. Yeah, so here he's, sorry, go ahead, 61.
I was just going to rationalize and say that it's just the beginning of the section, so we're just absorbing it.
Yeah, that's fair. That might be the reason. So I was just going to say that, yeah, so he's bringing back this idea of alienation that we saw in the introduction. This humanism that reappears in each of these stages of encyclopedism is an attempt to regain something that has been alienated from human nature. So human nature is separated from something that should belong to it. And then, so today, or at the time he's writing in the 20th century, technical reality is alienated from human nature. It's experienced as something foreign and alien, and so the task is to reincorporate it into human culture. And so this would be another form of humanism. So who would like to continue from here?
Okay. The Renaissance defined a humanism capable of compensating for the alienation resulting from ethical and intellectual dogmatism. It aimed at regaining the freedom of theoretical intellectual thought. The 18th century wanted to rediscover the signification of the effort of human thought applied to technics, and with the idea of progress, rediscover the nobility of creative continuity that can be found in inventions. It has defined the right of a technical initiative to exist despite the inhibiting forces of societies. The 20th century seeks a humanism capable of compensating for the form of alienation that intervenes within the very development of techniques, through a series of specializations that society demands and produces. There appears to be a singular law of the transformation, devenir, of human thought, according to which any ethical, technical, and scientific invention, which sets out as a means of liberation and rediscovery of man, becomes through its historical evolution an instrument that turns against its liberation and enslaves man by limiting him. At its origin, Christianity was a liberating force, calling on man to go beyond the formalism of customs and the institutional prestige of ancient society. It was the thought according to which the Sabbath is made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. It is this same Christianity, however, which the reformers of the Renaissance accused of being a force of rigidity, tied to a constraining formalism and dogmatism, contrary to the real and profound sense of human life. The Renaissance opened physis to anti-physis. Similarly, technics, invoked as a liberation through progress during the Enlightenment, are today accused of oppressing man and reducing him to slavery by denaturing him, of estranging him from himself through a specialization that is a barrier and source of incomprehension. The center of convergence has become a principle of partitioning. This is why humanism can never be a doctrine, or even an attitude capable of being defined once and for all. Each epoch must discover its humanism by orienting itself towards the main danger of alienation. During the Renaissance, the rigidity of dogma led to the emergence of a new fervor and a new movement, elan.
This is again something I think we can characterize as a dialectical mode of reasoning or of conceptual exposition here. So he talks about how what at one time can be a liberating force can be inverted into its opposite, can become a force constraining human development. So Christianity appears in the ancient world as a force that liberates humans from formalism, and then by the time of the Renaissance, it is presented as, the Reformation, it's presented as a new kind of formalism that has to be overcome again, that has to be renewed. And so in the same way, technology or technical reality appears at the time of the Encyclopedia as a form of liberation and of a sphere of human progress and invention. And then by the 20th century, technical reality appears as something that alien and oppressive. So the task is always different in each different era. So the humanism has a different task of liberation depending on what the form of alienation is in that era.
I like the excuse me. I like when he says that humanism can never be a doctrine or even an attitude capable of being defined once and for all. I think this is this particularly rings with me because I've been focusing just recently on the jargon of humanity and the kind of cult of man, so to speak. And a lot of the post-war German intellectuals kind of relating to this humanism as something specifically specifically related to the kind of German jargon that was used, a certain kind of code which was said to have infected the Germans in this wartime period, and this kind of defining of what it is human, what is human, what is the human, what is man, you know, where you can include or exclude people from it, or where things can be categorically diverse, where humanism is kind of a code for, you know, we're human, but we don't know about you being human. You lack some kind of inwardness or authenticity, or you know, some commitment of some spiritual commitment. And this sense of like humanism or humanity, I think, is really crucial in its fragility, in the sense of the term, like and Simondon likely similarly, he doesn't want to say, oh, humanism is this like overwhelming force which does this and that, and he doesn't want to engage in this kind of jargon. He wants to kind of distance himself from a kind of univocal humanism, and seems like he wants to make humanism a historical contingency, so to speak, related to technical objects and such.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. The historical contingency, humanism as a historical contingency. So you could oppose that to what you could call, I guess, an essentialist humanism. So it'd be a humanism that's based on some idea of human nature. So you have some list of properties that are supposed to characterize the human being uniquely, whether it's, you know, rationality or I don't know, spirituality, or whatever you want to pick as your set of properties. But as you point out, this type of essentialist humanism can easily lend itself to excluding other people from the human. So you can say, you know, this group of people is not properly human because they don't have this this property that I'm taking to be the essence of humanity. But this type of contingent humanism that Simondon is proposing, or you could call it, I guess, a dynamical humanism. So he's not proposing any set of properties or any essence of what it is to be human, but he's thinking of humanism here as an overcoming of alienation within each contingent historical circumstance. So it's not there's no sort of fixed essence of what it is to be human, but there's an overcoming of the alienation of certain elements of culture from the human.
Yeah, but as he was speaking of the alienation, I guess one of the aspects I'm scared about the most is what is a fundamental requirement of access to that type of knowledge. And in my case, it would just be necessity, the universal necessity of speaking English, and that bringing a certain access to approach the resources that even is available to a certain type of liberation, but then what type of liberation has the fundamental requirement of speaking English has enforced. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fair to point to the limitations of this I guess form of humanism. It's not so there's still this initiatory aspect or this dependence on particularism of the English language, for example. Even though English has become sort of the lingua franca of the world, it still requires this this teaching and this initiation into the language, this particular language. And so there is going to be differences in terms of access of who has the capacity to send their kids to English school or something like that, or which people are raised in an English-speaking society and which ones aren't. There's going to be differences in access in that sphere as well. So even though this stage of encyclopedism is meant to have this sort of universal significance through the use of images, there's still remnants of this earlier stage where you have to rely on the word, which is always particular in that sense, in the sense that it relies on initiation into a certain language group.
Yeah, maybe the concern is not quite so much socio-economical or monetary, I guess more in mental space. But yeah, that wasn't a particular point germane to his theorization, more of just correlation to contemporary situations.
So by mental space, you're referring to, I guess, like the fact that it just takes more effort for someone to work in English if that's not their first language, compared to someone who's working in their first language. Is that what you mean?
No, I mean like for instance, for the average person, it takes a lot to learn a language, and not necessarily for it to become slower, but just the fact for it to take any space at all. And there's a certain prioritization. Like for instance, in Canada, you look at so many second, third generation immigrants who don't speak their original language at all, and therefore do not have a substantial understanding about their origins of political struggle or even cultural significance. Like I've in my perspective, I met Chinese people who can't speak anything, and frankly is understanding Taoism from an English translation point of view, which is extremely reductive, and and therefore has shifted a lot regarding their political opinion and everything that trickles down from that. So I guess that's what I mean by mental capacity and attention, that monetary or capital is very regainable, but that initial attention or initial familiarity, or even as what Simandan talked here as the intuition that is built during the childhood phase, is completely lost.
Right. So yeah, I think that's a good point. That's this that so this the new stage of encyclopedism that he's pointing to doesn't fully overcome the previous sort of exclusive aspects of culture and this particularism of culture. So there's the universality doesn't eliminate the particularism, and so there's still because there are multiple particular cultures, there's still something that is lost when you're not initiated into one culture versus another one.
just this whole conversation kind of also puts me in mind of Chantal Mouffe's ideas about the paradoxes of democracy, that there's a kind of similar dynamic going on where, to be human is kind of an open question. And so the need to just kind of perpetually negotiate the universal and the particular.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with her work, but that sounds like something similar to what is going on in this text. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next section, and I can read. Man no longer needs a universalizing liberation, but a mediation. The new magic will not be found in a direct expression of the individual power to act, assured by the knowledge that gives each gesture effective certainty, but by the rationalization of forces that situate man by giving him meaning within a human and natural ensemble. The very fact that teleology is treated as a knowable mechanism that is not definitively mysterious is indicative of the attempt not to accept a situation as one simply lives it and is subjected to it. Rather than seeking the procedure for the fabrication of objects without making a pact with matter, man frees himself from his situation of being enslaved by the finality of the whole, by learning how to create finality, by learning how to organize the finalized whole that he judges and appreciates, so as not to have to be passively subjected to a de facto integration. Cybernetics, being a theory of information and as a consequence also a theory of finalized structures and dynamisms, frees man from the constraining enclosure of organization by enabling him to judge this organization rather than being subjected to it, while venerating and respecting it because he is not capable of thinking or constituting it. So a footnote here. In past centuries, an important cause of alienation lay in the fact that the human being lent his biological individuality to technical organization. He was bearer of tools. Technical ensembles could establish themselves only by incorporating man as a tool bearer. The deforming aspect of the profession was at once psychic and somatic. The tool bearer was deformed by the usage of tools. Professional somatic deformations have become rare in the present day. In the repugnance felt by the gentleman, l'honnêton, toward men of the trade, there is perhaps a part of the unpleasant feeling that one has when seeing a monstrosity. Today's occupational hazards are minimal with respect to the professional deformations of the past. For Plato, the banausos is a bald dwarf. In the song legend, the shoemaker is a disinherited creature. Now, end of the footnote. Man overcomes enslavement by consciously organizing finality, just as he dominated the unfortunate necessity of work during the 18th century by rationalizing it so as to render work efficient rather than suffering through it in resignation. Human society, in knowing its own teleological mechanisms, is the result of conscious human thought, and consequently incorporates those who create it. It is the product of a human effort of organization, and creates an adequation between the fact of being situated and the fact of situating oneself. The place man has in a society thereby becomes a relation between an element of activity and an element of passivity, as a mixed status always liable to being taken up again and improved, because it is something human that is interrupted but not alienated. Consciousness is at once a demiurgic activity and the result of a preceding organization. Social reality is contemporary with human effort and homogeneous with it. Only a schema of simultaneity, a constellation of forces represented in their relational power, can be adequate for this type of reality. Its development is what such a dynamic representation of man in society postulates. Cybernetic schemas can only acquire a universal sense in a society that is already constituted in a manner that conforms to this thought. The most difficult reactivity to establish is that of a society in relation to cybernetic thought itself. It can constitute itself only progressively and via the mediation of already established channels of information, such as the exchanges, for example, between techniques working synergistically on a given point. It is this type of grouping that Norbert Wiener cites as the source of this new technology, which is a techniques of techniques, at the beginning of his Cybernetics, published in 1948, and which is a new discourse on method, written by a mathematician teaching at an Institute of Technology. Cybernetics grants man a new type of majority, one that penetrates the relations of authority by distributing itself across the social body, and discovers the maturity of reflection beyond the maturity of reason, thereby giving man, in addition to the freedom to act, the power to create organization by establishing teleology. Consequently, both finality and organization, which can now be rationally thought and created since they become a matter of techniques, are no longer ulterior, superior reasons, capable of justifying everything. If finality becomes an object of techniques, then there is something beyond finality in ethics. Cybernetics, in this sense, frees man from the unconditional prestige of the idea of finality. Man freed himself through techniques from social constraint. Through the technology of information, he becomes creator of this organization of solidarity that hitherto imprisoned him. The stage of technical encyclopedism can only be provisional. It calls for a stage of a technological encyclopedism that completes it by giving the individual a possibility of returning to the social, which now changes status and becomes the object of an organizational construction, rather than being the acceptance of a valorized given or one that is fought, but which subsists within its primitive characteristics external to the activity of man. Individual nature is thus no longer external to the human domain. After acceding to freedom comes access to authority, in the full sense of the term, i.e. that of creative force.
Now, this is a rather complicated paragraph.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and it's a long paragraph with a lot of different elements. So maybe we can go through it sort of in order. So the first thing is he's opposing this new stage of encyclopedism that he's calling for is not going to be universalizing like the older ones. It's going to be a mediation. So it will situate the individual human being in relation to a wider technical reality, rather than like the old encyclopedia, giving the individual human mastery over the totality of technical knowledge of that era. And so he's introducing here for the first time the idea of cybernetics, or well, he mentioned it sort of in passing in the introduction, I think, but this is the first more detailed discussion of the topic. But cybernetics as the science of teleology. So teleology meaning goal-directedness or finality. So cybernetics is, in this understanding, is the science or the study of finality or goal-directedness in technical objects. And so by making teleology into something that can be studied rationally in scientific terms, it incorporates it into human culture, rather than teleology being something that human beings are submitted to. It's something that human beings can master collectively.
I don't recall, did you read the footnote for 12?
Yes, so here in the footnote, he's contrasting, so he's pointing to the ways in which in earlier societies, specialization or the division of labor led to these occupational deformities. So this is something that continues up until the 19th, maybe early 20th century, where particular occupations, because of exposure to certain chemicals or repetitive movements or whatever it is, would have these characteristic diseases or deformities, so that each by being specialized in one particular field of labor, a person would be even physically subjected to that field of work through these deformities or diseases, and that's something that's with the introduction of safety measures and things like that has been definitely reduced in the 20th and into today.
It's a long shot, but do you happen to know what he claims Plato calls a bald dwarf? What that term indicates in Greek?
No, I'm not sure. I would guess it's a minor, but that's just a guess. I'm going to see if I can find it.
Okay.
But yeah, we can continue as I try to look that up. But so let's see. We looked at cybernetics as a science of teleology. Right. So
right, and the cybernetics, the etymology comes from like ship steering, if I'm correct, in the Greek. The cyber, it means kind of an orientation. So I guess when you're talking about like the and this is what Norbert Wiener uses as to coin. I guess he must have coined cybernetics, right? I'm pretty sure he did. Maybe it was someone else, but yeah, no, this relates very much to like the already organized kind of purposes of activity, which is related to like the teleological criteria, or like the aim of of something rather than just some practice.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Wiener that coined the term cybernetics, and yes, so it comes from the Greek kybernetes, like the helmsman of a ship. It's so he understood it as the science of the government of processes in machines and in animals, and so it's the science of goal directedness in general, in the sense that processes are governed in relation to a certain goal.
And the characterization of cybernetics as a technics of technics. Do you have any insight into how this kind of cybernetics could indicate the second order techniques?
Where does that come up? The techniques of techniques? I don't remember that.
Oh, it's in the part where Wiener is mentioned. Just in the middle of 120, about halfway through.
Okay, yeah. So I see it now. Yeah. So it says, it is this type of grouping that Norbert Wiener cites as the source of this new technology, which is the techniques of techniques at the beginning of cybernetics. Right. So here again, he's using the word technology to mean the science of technical reality, or the study of technical reality, as opposed to that technical reality itself. So cybernetics is a techniques of techniques, in the sense that it allows for it's the study of setting up technical systems in such a way that they'll be directed towards a certain goal.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds. It just I hadn't run across that precise phrasing before. The techniques of techniques. Is interesting to consider cybernetics as this second order technique, sort of a technique on techniques, so to speak. But I suppose this isn't just for cybernetics, but all technology is supposed to be techniques of techniques. Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. So technology, as the study of technical reality, would be itself a technical operation. So it is something that operates on technical reality in order to orient it in a certain way, or to organize it in a certain way. I just posted in the chat a link to the dictionary entry on banausos, that Greek term that was cited in the footnote there. So it means a craftsman or an artisan, and it has a derogatory sense.
I'm honestly curious as to where Plato characterizes the craftsman as a bald dwarf. Like I want to know which Plato, which book is this written in? I'm curious. Maybe I can find that.
Yeah, there are a few different like search engines you can use, where you can search in the corpus of sort of classical Greek texts, like Plato, Aristotle, and so on. So you can look up a certain word and see which books they use them in, which is a pretty useful resource.
Nice. I'll have to seek those out.
Okay, so is there anything else in that last paragraph? I think we covered the main. Oh, so one last point is so he opposes right towards the end of that long paragraph, near the bottom of 120. He opposes the technical encyclopedism. So I guess that's pointing towards the 18th century Encyclopedia. So it's an encyclopedism that takes all the technical knowledge of a certain era and sort of organize it in such a way that an individual can become master of this technical knowledge. He opposes this technical encyclopedism to what he calls the technological encyclopedism, which is what he's pointing towards with cybernetics. So that would technological encyclopedism would, instead of giving the individual mastery of technical reality of that era, so because of the technical reality of the 20th century and the 21st century, of course, as well, is beyond what any individual can master. This technological encyclopedism would instead allow the individual to incorporate themselves into this technical reality, but in a conscious way. So the individual would not be subordinated to the finality of this technical reality, but they would be have a conscious understanding of the finality, and the finality of these arrangements would be consciously decided.
Kind of puts me in mind of the open source software movement today. The fact that it's no longer just the case that you go and learn about some particular technique, but that you go and kind of invest yourself in a social reality of manipulating software and forking it and doing different things with it according to the utility with which you find yourself in a group of other people, what you want to accomplish with it.
Yeah, I think we've brought up open source software in previous discussions, maybe in relation to the technical mentality paper or previous texts that we read from Simondon. And I think that's definitely something that he would have been interested in if he had lived to see it. So it's, the idea of developing software for its own sake, and rather than sort of submitting that software to commercial imperatives and the ways that it can deform technical progress that he's discussed in a few different places. It would have a sort of autonomous development, and it's part of a social organization where there's more, like the sort of community of open source development is more than any one person can master or organize. So each person is incorporated into that social structure or organization through the work that they do to make progress of the software happen. Okay, so we can continue with the next bit. I think we'll probably just finish this section since we're coming up on 2 hours. So there's a couple more paragraphs, so I will start reading. Such are the 3 stages of the encyclopedic spirit, which was first ethical, then technical, and which can then become technological by going beyond the idea of finality taken as ultimate justification. However, it is wrong to say that the techniques of finalized organization are useful only because of their practical results. They are useful in the sense that they bring finality from the magical level to the technical level. Whereas the evocation of a superior end and of the order that realizes this end is considered to be the final term in the search for its justification, because life is conflated with finality in an age when technical schemas are mere schemas of causality. The introduction of technological schemas of finality in thought plays a cathartic role. That of which there is a technics cannot act as an ultimate justification. Both individual life and social life contain many aspects of finalized processes, but perhaps finality is not the most profound aspect of individual or social life, any more so than the different modalities of finalized actions, such as adaptation to a milieu. So he's bringing up again something that we didn't discuss. It was in the last paragraph, but we didn't mention it. But this notion that cybernetics or this technological encyclopedism, by giving society mastery over finality, by developing this techniques of finality, it means that finality can no longer be an ultimate justification. So the idea, in a society that doesn't have this mastery over finality, the idea of society being organized towards a certain end can be used as a sort of ultimate justification. There's an order, a natural order of things, and certain people are serfs, and certain people are lords, and certain people are I don't know, merchants or whatever, and that's just the natural order of things. But once you have this development of a techniques of finality, that finality can no longer be an ultimate justification for why things are the way they are. So by having this technological schema of finality as a part of our cultural heritage, if you want to call it that, it means that we can sort of exercise that justification of a certain order through based on the concept of finality. Okay, so who would like to read the last paragraph?
I can knock this one out. I'm mapping. I'm trying to figure out how these stages of the encyclopedic spirit map onto the developments in in cybernetics in the 20th century. And I have like this crazy chart that I'm trying to figure out right now, like drawing a bunch of lines to other lines and stuff. But anyway, one could undoubtedly say that it is not a veritable finality that animates the processes of recurrent causality with negative reaction. At the very least, this technical production of teleological mechanisms enables the most inferior, most primitive aspect of finality to leave the magical domain behind. The subordination of a means to an end, hence the superiority of an end with respect to its means. By becoming a technical matter, such organization is henceforth the only one of the aspects of social or individual life, and its prestige can no longer mask the possibilities for the development, advent, and emergence of new forms, which cannot be justified by finality, since they produce their own end as the last term of evolution. Evolution maladapts as much as it adapts. The realization of adaptations is but one of life's aspects. Homeostases are partial functions. Technology, in incorporating them and allowing them not only to be thought, but to be brought into existence rationally, leaves the open processes of social and individual life fully exposed. In this sense, technology reduces alienation.
So again, technology here meaning the study of technical reality or the understanding of technical reality.
So, this technical, at least in terms of the stages of the encyclopedic spirit, the technological seems to correspond precisely with the cybernetic, right? Because it's the cybernetic third stage of the encyclopedic spirit, which is technological. Am I getting that right? Like the first step, the Renaissance is ethical, then the Enlightenment stage is technical, and the cybernetic stage is technological.
Yeah, that's how I understand it as well. I think that's right.
Okay, I have to add second order and third order cybernetics on top of this. Make a giant diagram.
Yeah, that'd be interesting too. I mean, I'm not very familiar with second order cybernetics and that sort of field, but it would be interesting if you could post that in the chat when you're done with that.
Once I figure it out, yeah, I'll gladly do that. I just learned that third order cybernetics was like a thing, like I think this morning actually, from some cursory research on the ethical regulator, this kind of apparatus which is supposed to function ethically or something like that. Some fun cybernetic stuff, but I almost like did a double take. I was like, wait a second, third order cybernetics? Like, I didn't think this was a thing. I swear before I told a few people, I was like, there's no point in going beyond the second order here. Like, just don't have to think third and fourth and fifth or whatever. But then I see somebody citing third order cybernetics as like a relevant factor. But yeah, I'm still having trouble understanding second order cybernetics, and that's what I'm working on more so. So I think talk about third order cybernetics is very recent, actually.
But yeah, the different developments in cybernetics would be something that again, this would have happened after this was published, and probably I think after Simondon died in 1980, I believe. It's sort of beyond the scope of this text, but it's something that I'm sure he would have been interested in studying and following as well.
Right. Yeah. I think what is his name? Forster. Gosh, I always forget his name. The second order cybernetics guy.
Heinz von Forster. Sorry. Yeah. Go on.
No, I'm just recollecting various details at this point. I don't really have a cogent theme to my critique here. But yeah, no, there's definitely like a few big names that were writing in the 70s and 80s, I suppose, a little bit, but Simondon is probably just the kind of backdrop for a lot of this writing, rather than I don't know, actually. I mean, I shouldn't say that, because I don't know how much dialogue he had with the second order cybernetics people. Like, maybe he corresponded with Luhmann or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the sort of direct intellectual interaction that there was between them. like Simondon borrows a lot of cybernetic concepts and makes reference to some of the classic texts of cybernetics, like Wiener's book. But I'm not sure how much direct interaction he had with the sort of cybernetic movement or society, like as an organized society.
I'm not sure, but I think he may have actually gone to the Macy conferences. Like Simondon was actually in attendance to the Macy conferences in certain years.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned that a few weeks ago, and that's yeah, that would be really interesting to sort of track down which ones he attended and who he may have interacted with while he was there, because yeah, like all the sort of leading names of cybernetics were involved in those conferences.
Yeah, I'm definitely reading now that that Simondon is cited as an influence for Luhmann. So I don't know if they interacted, but they Luhmann definitely was. Well, quote, with the help of the theories of machines developed by Simondon, ... Luhmann's blah 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 blah. So yeah, it's definitely considered to be what's the word, a predecessor in some regards.
I'm just reading a review here that says Wiener gave a widely publicized lecture at the Collège de France in 1950 and was the featured speaker in 1962 at the prestigious Colloque Philosophique International organized by Simondon at Royaumont. So he actually hosted Wiener as a speaker in 1962.
Oh.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, that's so yeah, they obviously had some direct contact. You know, who knows exactly what they would have discussed at the time, but yeah, that's interesting that they had that direct contact like that. Okay, so we're almost at 2 hours now, so I think we'll leave the fourth section for next time, and I don't think it's very long, so we'll probably get through the fourth section of the chapter and then go on to, yeah, it's about 6 pages, and then we'll go on to chapter 2 and see how far we get in there as well. So thank you everyone for joining in and for your participation, and I'll see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you everybody. I'm gonna try to get this recording and the last one, I guess, made into nice little MP3 files so we can listen to them at our leisure. So hopefully that will be ASAP. I'll let y'all know. Just check the room for details, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks again for volunteering to edit the files. It's a big help.
Oh yeah, no problem. It's fairly easy for me on my end. Besides like taking a while to like load the giant files, the other part's easy. So no problem at all. My pleasure, of course.
Okay, bye everybody.
All right, see you next time.
Bye.